Don't expect any of this rum.
It's not a bad thing.
Shall we start? Yeah. Jim, what do you reckon?
Please, yeah.
Great,
So,
that's good.
yeah, you solutions in the back then.
All right, we'll get started.
I work in wine. It's just I've got to stop the rum festival.
Got to start talking now, quick.
No more. No, just kidding. Right, okay, let's get started. So this is a seminar called Lessons in Rum. It's a very good way with a, because a session like this, you got a real mix of uber geek and new to rum. And Lessons in Rum is a good way of covering the various topics to give you kind of a crash course in rum. And of course, with questions and interaction, we can go in more detail with some of the topics for the uber geeks. So it's a good seminar that way. I am, in the beginning though, going to just do a little bit about Foursquare, because I am supposed to be here to market Foursquare a little bit. So we'll do that very briefly, and then we'll go into Lessons in Rum. Because my feeling is that when you have a masterclass, it's an opportunity to educate people. So, we are tasting 2 rums. Normally I don't do a lot of tasting because that's what outside there is for. And as I say, I don't normally do a lot of marketing because you're meant to be here, you're meant to be, in my opinion, I feel you're meant to be a little bit free of marketing and get an education. But first, a little bit about us. So the first thing I like to explain to people is how come we have so many names? How come it's the Seale family? How come it's Foursquare Distillery? How come we have a rum called Dorley's at the stand? And the explanation is, it's again very much like Scotch whiskey. You have to understand that distiller and bottler were separate. And today, many of those distilling Scotch whiskey brands, their history is independent of distilleries. It's the same way in Barbados. The Seale family were what you would call independent bottlers. We didn't call them independent bottlers, we just called them bottlers. And there were people who traded in various commodities, wines and spirits, and they would trade in rum. They'd buy the rums from the distilleries, and they'd blend and bottle and put their name on it. And when they put their name on it, literally put their name on it in a very austere way, blended and bottled by R.L. Seale and Company. And the names evolved in brands. And another famous bottler also at the time was Martin Dorley. So today we still bottle and blend and now distill rums under our name, R.L. Seale, and rums under the Martin Dorley name. 2 very, very old names in rum in Barbados. I'm 4th generation, so my family started bottling rum in 1926. Martin Dorley a little bit earlier. The requirement to separate distillery and bottler was actually by law in 1906. That was relaxed, I think around the 80s. And so what we did is we started to release some special editions under the Foursquare name. The earliest session you had with Real McCoy is an example of us working in a partnership brand. So we're not a contract bottler, you just can't order our stuff to go and for you. But people do come to us with different ideas, and Real McCoy was a group of people that came to me with a project to develop the Real McCoy brand because of this historic connection between famous rum runner Bill McCoy, and he did run a hell of a lot of Barbados rum. It's a very amusing story in itself. And so they came, and we have a partnership with them. And for us, as a small family-owned producer, this was a great opportunity to sell in America. So they do sell over here, but they're primarily a big American brand. It was a great opportunity for us to tackle the American market, which is something very difficult for a small family business to do. So that's the Dorleys, Real McCoy, R.L. Seale. So we have 2 sets of Foursquares. We split the Foursquares into series. This series, known as the ECS series, is typically sometimes between 20 and 30,000 bottles. You can taste them all there at the stand. And then this is what we call the Velier series, because it's exclusively imported by Velier. For those who went to you can see them at the Velier stand or the Velier classes. These are much smaller. The biggest one we've ever done with that is 400 bottles. And these are sold only in Europe. ECS is sold in Europe and America. This is actually only primarily imported into Italy. And so that's why I've actually chosen these two for us to sample, because this is probably the hardest ones for you to have an opportunity to taste. I mean, they are available at our stand and the Velier stand, but because they're primarily imported into Europe, they only get a handful of bottles on the secondary market come to the UK. So that's what I thought I'd show these two off, because I don't know if you probably got an opportunity. The only downside to showing these two off in a class which I don't know the audience, these are both cask strength. So with the ECS series, we do a variety of strength. With the Velier series, it's only cask strength. For those of you who do not experience drinking cask strength spirits, don't fear it. It's something you can learn. Take a small sip. There's a lot of flavor packed in there. It's not been watered down to the strengths that you typically know, like 40%. Take a small sip and your palate will actually get accustomed to it. One of the things I do hope you find is that one of the things that's very, very much the signature of Foursquare rums is that they're very, very soft. And so I hope you actually find that the experience of drinking a cask strength rum was a lot better than you thought. So just a little bit about Foursquare. We're still continuing about Foursquare. That's us in Barbados. That's coming in. It's walking in the distillery. These are our two stills. Now I do a whole other seminar on why we have those two stills. So I will not get diverted on it there. If not, we will never get to the finish of the seminar. But probably you can shoot me some questions later. But we both use both the traditional pot still and a classic twin column coffee still. That's one of our four large aging warehouses. Obviously, age rums is our core activity. If you want to sell old rum, you need a lot of barrels, because when you fill 100 barrels today, when they get to 10 years old, they're less than 50 barrels. So we have one of the large, even though we're a relatively small producer, because our average age of what we sell is quite high, we have one of the largest reserves of any producer in the Caribbean. There's probably only a handful of producers larger than us. We have been very successful. Again, my approach with marketing is not to come and tell you that the rums are wonderful. I'd rather let other people tell you that the rums are wonderful. And so one of the ways we do that, unfortunately today, competitions are not worth a lot because there's too many of them. There's far too many gold medals given out with dubious competitions. There are the two All London competitions, which we do still respect. They get a large entry. They're pretty stingy with their goals. And they do have a lovely, big, fancy black tie dinner with their awards. Being black tie, that leaves me out completely. So I have never actually collected any of these awards. So we did it in 2016. We actually celebrated 90 years in 2016. Sorry, actually, I forget. Just jumped ahead. Just Foursquare. We came to Foursquare in the 90s. Foursquare is way older than us. Started in the 1730s as a sugar, rum, and molasses estate. Went full on sugar in the 19th century. Closed in the 80s. We went there in the 90s. And so all of these, what you would call independent brands, everything's produced at Foursquare. And then, as I say, we started to release our special rums under the Foursquare label. So we celebrated 90 years, my family. Well, as I say, Foursquare goes way, way back, 1730s, but we started in 1926. And so we decided to have some fun and go into the London competitions, and we had a hell of a ride. So in 2016, we took the Rum Trophy and Rum Producer Trophy at ISE. Did the same thing again at IWSE in the same year. So we took an unprecedented doubles. We dominated this competition. Just over 200 entries. They only get 9 gold medals. As you say, pretty stingy. And we took 5 of them. Over here in the ISE, it's not quite as big. You think about 130 entries. They only gave 12 goals. We took 6 of them. And again, we also took, as I say, trophy and Rum Producer. And then this year, the ISE, at the beginning of the year, we took, again, Rum Producer Trophy. They did hand out 2 rum trophies. We took both of them. And we also took this award, which is actually pretty special. So what the ISC does is they have from all 1,600 entries, from all the different categories, they take all the trophy winners in the different categories, rum, brandy, whiskey, they even have a category for vodka, if you believe it. And they sit down and they decide which is the best spirit of the competition. We took it with Foursquare 2005, which you can taste in the booth. But the significance of it was that it's the first time in the history of the competition that one ever won Supreme Champion Spirit. So we think that once that door is open, we think it's going to be won a lot more by rum. As you guys all know, rum is by far the best spirit. And same thing with the IWC. It was about 230 entries this year. They were pretty stingy, only gave out 8 goals, and we took 4 of them. So we are shortlisted. We'll find out in the dinner, big awards dinner on the 14th if we've won the Rum Producer Trophy again. But judging by their emails where they say, please, 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 please come to the dinner. Yeah, never ever, there's a rule of thumb, when these awards dinner write you and ask you for tickets, never respond. And you see with their increasing desperation whether you won something. Good strat. I did it totally innocently the first year. I was like, well, I don't know if I can come in, so I won't respond. It's the best move ever. So now on to the lesson part. That was the Foursquare marketing part. Now lessons in rum. So again, we're going to cover some interesting topics, various, I wouldn't say controversial topics, but they're topics that a lot of misinformation is around out there. So a mix of controversial and simply misinformation. So this is my opportunity to come here, as I say, a bit of crash course and cover some different lessons and hopefully set the record straight. First one, rum originated in Barbados. Now again, this is sometimes written as, you know, the origins of rum is somehow written as controversial or it's unclear, or you hear some terrible origin stories that, you know, someone in Barbados was sitting around trying to figure out what to do with this molasses, was throwing it away, and then somebody had a eureka moment. All of this is complete nonsense. And then you might hear some interesting story. Well, they maybe distilled some sugarcane out in Indonesia. It's very interesting. Maybe they distilled some in Brazil. Again, this is very interesting. But these are technical and scientifically relevant facts. The claim I am making is a cultural and social claim. Rum is a cultural and social beverage. The origin of drinking rum as a cultural and social beverage originated in Barbados in the 1640s. And that is unequivocal, and I'll explain why. We are very fortunate. We have this early history of Barbados, published by Richard Ligon in 1673. He visited the island in 1647. It was great timing. Sugar had started in 1640. What happened was Barbados had been colonized in 1625. We'd been visited by the Portuguese in the 1500s, but they didn't stop. There was another visit by the English in 1605, and they sort of claimed Barbados in the name of King James, but it didn't stop. There was a formal colonization in 1625, and the first thing they tried to do, and they were going out there to make their fortune. They were going out there to plant the available land and hopefully make some money. And they started first with tobacco and cotton. And tobacco was a disaster. We could not compete with Virginia. Barbados' tobacco tasted terrible. We were actually very, very good with cotton, but the cotton was fluctuated very badly, and so it was a big high risk at the time. We were very fortunate because at this time, the Dutch were over in Brazil, Pernambuco, today's Recife. They were over there, and they had taken over the Portuguese sugar estates. They'd been making sugar there in what we know as Brazil, probably like nearly 100 years before this. Columbus having brought it out, and they were making sugar. And when the crowns of Portugal and Spain amalgamated, the Dutch saw that as fair game to take over the Portuguese area of Brazil. They took over the sugar making, but the Portuguese didn't like this and basically put them under a siege. They would eventually chuck them out completely in 1654. And so what happened is the Dutch wanted to preserve this valuable and increasingly in value sugar trade, and so they taught Barbadians how to make sugar. One notable gentleman by the name of James Drax. They came over to Brazil, they learned sugar making, they went back to Barbados. They had done some early trials in Barbados in the 1630s, discovered that sugar cane would grow very well in Barbados. The key thing to understand is the timing of this. The timing is perfect. Sugar is starting to be used on a bigger scale. So the Portuguese, yes, have had sugar for nearly 100 years, but it's an exotic substance going into Europe. Getting into sugar now is like being in the oil business as soon as they've developed an automobile. This is perfect timing. London is now starting to have its first coffee houses. So the demand for sugar will explode in the next few years. James Drax perfected what was a very, very difficult process. And it spread very quickly. And it spread very quickly in Barbados because we were flat and because we stayed English. So in very short order, Barbados was an enormous sugar producer and far, far ahead of anywhere else in the Caribbean. And enormous fortunes were made. I mean, the Drax family, they built a beautiful plantation home in Barbados. It's still there today. They went back to England and built stately homes and bought parliamentary seats and developed a wealth, as I say, that still exists today. The other timing is that this is the time that Europe is starting to drink alcoholic beverages for the first time as a social drink. So yes, distillation had been around for a couple hundred years, but it was something an alchemist did. It was something you bought in an apothecary. It's only now in this period you're starting to drink. So this is perfect timing to get in the distillation of spirits business. And how did we get into it? Well, the Dutch, while they did nick the technology of sugar making for the Portuguese, the Dutch at this time were very, very clever at distillation. Fermented cane juice was around from Brazil, so they knew how to make fermented cane juice, which was a alcoholic beverage. But in come the Dutch, they have knowledge of distillation, and they start distilling cane juice. Another piece of the puzzle is the English Navy. The English Navy leaves England with beer. By the time it's in the Caribbean, the beer is no good. We replace it with rum. Today, you associate Navy rum with Guyana and Jamaica, because that's who they were buying it from in the 20th century, because Guyana and Jamaica were huge, huge producers, and that's where the modern Navy sourced rum from. But the first naval rum, Barbadian, and would be Barbadian for some time. The thing also to grasp is the scale on which this explodes. As I say, this is perfect timing for sugar and the enormous wealth. But Barbados, in short order, becomes the biggest, if you're looking at whiskey, brandy, or rum, Barbados becomes the biggest spirits maker in the world. The scale is enormous. In the mid-1600s, Barbados is making 1 million gallons of rum. In Scotland, they're making 50,000 gallons of whiskey. 20 times bigger. In Ireland, Ireland is bigger than Scotland at this time. Ireland's about 130,000 gallons of whiskey. So this is why when someone tells me, oh, they found some record about somebody distilling something somewhere, and you're like, hey, please. Come on. This is not the same story. As I say, if you have this myth about somebody accidentally discovering something in Barbados, you might think that you found some other origin story. We're talking about two completely different things. The reason why we're here today is because of what happened in Barbados in the 1640s. Here's a recap of what we just talked about. So they say the Dutch were there, they brought sugar cane to Barbados. They got kicked out from Brazil. We have this earliest record of a mill coming in 1640. And Ligon gives us our earliest record of rum making. And the thing is, he records it as the drink of the island. So it's as interesting. Sugar rise in 1640. By 1647, it's the drink of the island. This is why we know it's not some accidental discovery. Another possible speculation here, we know from the 1700s the fermentation recipes are very, very sophisticated, so it's possibly speculated that the West Africans enforced over into the Caribbean may have brought knowledge of fermentation, which of course would have helped develop the industry. And we have all these early records of the word rum, because as I say, this is where the social and cultural birth of it is. So records of distillation elsewhere are not going to have the language that we use because it's not the birth of what we're talking about. So we have in 1651, Giles Sylvester in a letter referring to Barbados, he writes, the chief puddle in the making the islands rum bullion, yields Kildevil. Ligon called it Kildevil. And rum bullion, we speculate, was because of rumbustious being because of the chaos that rum caused, and bullion because of its great volume. And we also have in 1658 a reference to the word rum. So all this early language is from Barbados. And just a word here on Kildevil. It was called Kildevil not because it tasted bad, it was called Kildevil because it killed people. You're in the Caribbean, the heat, tropical disease, lack of health care, dangerous to drink water, dehydration, you drunk high-strength spirits from morning to night, it killed you. We've misinterpreted this with a modern lens to believe that somehow this stuff was rough or whatever, but we're certainly looking at the records, we have absolutely no reason to believe that this was anything other than beautiful, beautiful spirit. Here's some actual records from Ligon. This is where he describes that he's arrived in 1647 and sugar making is quite new. So as I say, the rapidity in which this grows is remarkable. This paragraph is where he describes double distillation. So this is why we know the technology is brought. This is not some accidental discovery. He's describing advanced double distillation here. As for distilling the skimmings, just run down to the still house. It is only after it's remained in the cisterns till it be a little sour. So why do they have to wait for the juice to get sour before they can distill it? What's happening?
Fermentation.
Yeah. So they don't know what fermentation is, but they know if you try to distill fresh juice, you will get nowhere. If you distill it after it gets sour, spirits will rise. So, I hope you're clear. Rum originated in Barbados. And it jumped very quickly to some of the other islands, but there are various reasons for different development. Jamaica didn't become English until 1655, and it took a little while for sugar to get going in Jamaica. So Jamaica wasn't really heavy in the rum business till about 1670s, 1680s. Spanish rum making was outlawed in 1693. So this is why the Spanish rum makers were very far behind the traditional rum producers of places like Barbados and Jamaica. So, listen to, rum is from sugar cane, it is not from sugar. It's a common misconception. I keep hearing people think that rum is from sugar, or that there's some special connection with sugar and rum. There is not. All that happens is that the same thing we use to make sugar cane, is the same thing we use to make rum. But no one would suggest the equally stupid notion that whiskey could be made from high fructose corn syrup. That is an equally stupid suggestion. It just happens to be that sugar cane, we crush sugar cane, we get that lovely sweet juice, and in there's lots of different sugars, and it has a high concentration of sucrose. And if you want crystal sugar, you have to have sucrose. If you don't have sucrose, all you can get is something like high fructose corn syrup. So high fructose corn syrup is made from corn. Corn has starch, it doesn't have sugar. You have to convert starch to sugar. But those sugars are simple sugars. They're not sucrose. They're things like fructose and glucose. And then you concentrate that and make that into high fructose corn syrup. Rum, sugarcane has sucrose, so you could make crystal sugar. You could make Also some kind of sugar syrup from grapes, but again, doesn't have the sucrose content. So this is the only link really with rum. Rum is not from sugar. All alcoholic beverages, the source of the alcohol is the fermentation of sugar. But if the flavor of alcoholic beverages was sourced from sugar, they would all taste the same. The flavor does not come from the sugar content. The flavor comes from what we call the substrate in which the sugar converts to alcohol. The sugar gives us our alcohol. It's the rest of the medium that gives us our flavor. That's why it's absurd to talk about making whiskey from high fructose corn syrup. And it is absurd to talk about making rum from sugar. Here, just to illustrate the point, this is spirit making in a nutshell. We start with different raw materials, we ferment them. The fermented is where the sugar is converted to alcohol. It's by convention. When we work with grains, we call it a beer. When we work with grapes or molasses, we can call it a wine. We then distill it. That is the difference between fermented beverages and distilled beverages. So over in one category, fermented beverages, which is wine and beer. Once you distill it, you go in the world of distilled beverages. That's the ones you commonly know, whiskey and rum and brandy. We do have this last step, maturation. But the key point to understand is that the flavor is derived from the raw material. It's not derived from the sugar. This is what's happening in fermentation. It doesn't even go from sucrose. The first thing the yeast does is break the sucrose into the constituent fructose and glucose and converts it. So this is what's happening with the sugar. It's got nothing to do with our flavor. That's simply the alcoholic content. Again, just to illustrate it from another direction and put together, if you don't know what sugar making is, I overheard someone recently insisting that rum was not from sugarcane, it was from molasses. So let me make that very clear. Rum is indeed from molasses, but molasses is from sugarcane. So we start with our lovely sugarcane. The first thing we do with it is crush it, turn it into juice. We can make rum from this because it has our sugarcane and it has our sugars in it that we can ferment to alcohol and we can make rum. Or we can send it to the evaporators and turn it into sugar syrup, just like what you can make at home. That's just boiling off the water, so the sugarcane substrate is still there. So in theory, we can make rum from sugarcane syrup. We commonly make rum from molasses. How do we get that? We send it to the vacuum pans, and the vacuum pans are very clever devices which get that thick sugar syrup. That sugar syrup is full of sugar, and what's going to happen is in there is some sucrose, in there is also some fructose and glucose, but we're going to heat it in the vacuum pan at a perfect temperature on the vacuum, and this is the thing that was genius to be done in the old days before vacuum pans, and the crystals are going to come out of solution. And we're going to have this thick black mass. It's black because of all the heating we've done, turning it into syrup. It's this thick black mass with all this crystal sugar in it, and that's what we call a massacre. Again, some people think today that you make sugar and somehow molasses is some kind of waste product that comes out. You actually make them simultaneously. Okay. What we do then is we send that to a centrifuge, pull those crystals out, that's sugar. The remaining molasses has all the sugars that didn't crystallize, and that's some of the sucrose. It all doesn't come out, and obviously it has all the simple sugars, the fructose and the glucose, which cannot crystallize. That's in the molasses, and boom, we can make rum. So the sugarcane is still present in all three of these. It's only not present when it's here. If you make something from this, it doesn't matter whether it came from beet molasses or whatever, it'll be the same thing. So it's a very important distinction. So it's a very common mistake that people think that somehow rum comes from sugar. And we get this all the time. Doesn't rum come from sugar? People think rum has more calories because it has sugar. Really, people ask me that all the time. Doesn't this have more calories than whiskey? No. It doesn't come from sugar? No. US history. Now, of course, you guys have a wonderful image of rum today, but I think you guys are well aware that in the environment that we operate is that rum doesn't have the best image, that it's cheap, it's low value, you know, it's something you drink in college or you must mix in cocktails. I often tell the story of how difficult it was for me to sell rum when I came here in the late 90s. When we came here, we were told rum had to be cheap and it had to taste like Bacardi. Absolutely true story, because this was the image of rum. And so people don't understand that today's image is really only something formed within the last few years. That rum's historical image is totally at odds with this. In fact, why was there rum on the British naval ship? Because whiskey was hardly known. Whiskey didn't get popular until the 1700s. Rum was popular way, way earlier than whiskey. And I'll show you. And basically, our golden era is the 17th and 18th centuries. The 19th century is more competitive, other spirits get, and there's all kinds of different protectionisms and stuff goes in. And then the 20th century, the reason why we really struggle in the 20th century is because the 20th century is the century of branding. It's a century when we move from these products being commodities to brands. And the poor Caribbean simply cannot compete with branding of the Europeans and Americans. It's impossible for us. We don't even have brands in most cases. So here are some early historians on rum. Hans Sloane, in a very famous publication, Boys Sea Islands in 1707. Rum is called Well Kill Devil. So I just want to, the reason why I make this quote is it's not a particularly attractive quote, because he more or less says it kills lots of people. But I just want to emphasize that this word kill devil again, I mean, literally I've had one brand, I've seen their marketing where they go, rum was called kill devil until we perfected it. You know, they pretended like it was called kill devil for like 200 years until, you know, they got it right. And then they made good rum. We were all suffering before that. And people believe this shit. No, it was called kill devil because it killed people. But here's the killer line. It cannot be used with too much moderation. The best thing to do is abstain from drinking it altogether. In other words, don't touch this stuff, because once you touch it, that's it. You're going to keep drinking it. And here, 1708, we'll mix in history of Barbados. Barbados, home of the famous spirit known as rum. Now, this is a very powerful piece of evidence. I made that first claim to you that Barbados is the home of rum. This is near contemporaneous evidence. So this is what people in 1708 thought, that Barbados is the home of rum. There's nothing more powerful than contemporaneous evidence. So Barbados, home of the famous spirit of rum, as they say, it's very famous. It's totally dominant in other spirits at this period, which by some persons is preferred to brandy. It is said to be very wholesome and therefore supplied in place of brandy and punch. Indeed, it is much better than the malt spirits and the sad liquors sold by our English distillers. Whiskey wouldn't get popular until the 1700s. Now, Jeff, in his seminar, covered this area very extensively, this bit about punch. Because again, if we read this with a modern lens, we get the wrong impression. Oh, they put it in punch, it must have didn't taste very good, and save their brandy for drinking straight. Only the very, very wealthy are drinking punch in this period. Only the wealthy can afford the lime and the sugars and the spices. This is the drink of the well-to-do. Here are some numbers. This is rum imports versus brandy imports into England. Notice they're quite small in this period. Even by 1700, drinking alcoholic beverages is still relatively small. Brandy and rum are competing for the top end. Stuff drunk by poor people is gin. How ironic today, huh? We've gone stupid, huh? So in this period, brandy is ahead. By the 1740s, you can see rum absolutely dominates brandy. And it's in 1713 that the French actually banned the importation of rum because it's a threat to their homegrown French brandy industry. This is how potent and powerful rum is. This is Barbados rum exports to America. So the Jamaicans, those exports to England were mostly Jamaica in the 1700s. Barbados we exported to America, American colonies, and British North America, which you guys know today is Canada. And we exported extraordinary amounts of rum to the American colonies. American colonies did not make one drinking drop of whiskey at this time. They drank rum. They would import some brandy as well. George Washington, his inauguration, he had rum. Rum was a drink in the American colonies. It was a two-tiered system. Poor people drank the New England rum. Don't tell my New England craft distiller friends. That was the cheap stuff. Sorry, it's true. And the good stuff was imported from the islands, particularly Barbados. Notice that says 1768. Terrible, terrible tragedy would occur. Those Americans would want to become independent, and with independence, they would stop drinking rum because it was colonial, and they then created and developed American whiskey. And by about 1830, they had literally switched from drinking rum to drinking whiskey. Barbados export industry was devastated. Wasn't also helped. We had a terrible, terrible hurricane in 1780. And you see how badly disrupted Puerto Rico was. Ours is even worse. And by the 19th century, we were out of the export business. We still made a lot of rum. But that legacy even comes today, because today, when you guys look and you look at all those old bottles of rum that people can find from 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, notice they're mostly Guyana and Jamaica. Very, very hard to find a Barbados bottle of rum, because we've more or less got out of the export business after the devastation of the American Revolution. We're very small. You have to appreciate we're a very small island compared with, well, eventually Demerara and Jamaica. But rum is so important that rum plays a role in the American Revolution itself. French banned rum imports in 1713. This is a decision that has enormous consequences, because what happens is the French islands now can't convert all of their molasses to rum. You gotta understand, at this point in time, you have 80% of your trade, 90% of your trade is export. So you ban exports, you really, really cripple the industries. So they ban imports, so the French now sell the molasses to those New England, hungry New England colonies who are making the rum, the mass cheap rum. So they have this molasses to sell cheap. In those days, it's the period of mercantilism. You do not trade outside of your own. And so the English passed the Molasses Act in 1733. This is an act with large taxation to deter importation of molasses. It fails miserably, and it's easily circumvented. So the English take a different approach with the Sugar Act in 1764. What they do with this one is they lower the rate of duty, but they intend this one to be collected. They send troops out into the American colonies. This is the fomenting of the resentment of taxation without representation. In other words, taxation without consent. You have to appreciate the Americans at this time. They don't want to be independent. They're very, very loyal to the British. But it's this taxation thing that's absolutely unacceptable to them. And they have a lot of supporters back home in England as well. But this costs money, and so they need to raise more money, and this is this constant, I mean, wonderful history to read, but this constant battle of the Americans. You know, the English are basically saying, well, we're protecting you, you know, with the British Navy, we need to tax you. And the Americans are very resentful of this. Stamp Act comes in. English thought that this was a very, very clever tax that no one would really notice because it was, you know, you just had to put a stamp on various documents. But they made a bad miscalculation, because the very people that were going to be using these documents were the very people that would protest and, you know, lead the whole intellectual charge against the English. So they taxed completely the wrong people. But I don't want to give you a whole history of the American Revolution. Boston Massacre was a case where the English troops, they were cornered, they were being jeered because they're there to collect the taxes. They then, like we see in so many cases, they panic, shoot fire on the Americans, and of course it's a tremendous, scandalous event. Boston Tea Party, that's where the tea comes in. They don't want to pay the tax. They pay a set of people dress up as Indians, board it, and chuck the tea out. And so all of this leads to the American Revolution, and it, you know, it's all started here. It's highly relevant to our history because, yeah, it causes whiskey to replace rum as the national drink. So the consequences are enormous. Here's just another little insight into the perception of rum. This is even as late as 1790. You know, today some people tell me this rum is really good. It's as good as a cognac or a whiskey. Well, guess what? They used to tell you in 1790. In 1790, they would tell you that this whiskey was equal to any rum for making punch. So they were trying to tell you this whiskey is really good because it was, as good as a rum. And even as recently as 1931, here's again a wine and spirits writer of his era, and he's describing rum as the Englishman's spirit. Whiskey Scotland and brandy French, gin Holland, rum's English. There's no independent colonies at this point in time. And of course he sadly writes, if rum was ever to disappear from the Navy rations, a great tradition would be tragically broken. So that's why I say most of the image of rum that's sort of been formed by, terrible things like Captain Morgan and that, is really very recent. This is Harwood House. We had show the Harwood House rum in the watch, the oldest rum ever discovered. It's a great insight as well into the way Barbados rum was perceived in this era. This is the kind of wealth that was generated. The Salves family owned several estates in Barbados and Jamaica. This is the kind of extraordinary wealth. Sugar barons were the oil sheiks of their day. I mean, the wealth was just immeasurable. And unfortunately, it wasn't, there was no scope to develop the islands like you might have today. They saw themselves as English, none of them saw themselves as Barbadian or Jamaican. There's no such concept. And, so all the wealth went back to England, and they built these enormous homes and various other means of spending their wealth. They lived incredibly well in the islands as well. They would import the best of everything. And so this was the Harwood House rum, 1780. That was, I can't remember how many bottles, it was discovered a couple of years ago, and then went for auction. But as I say, it gives us a real insight because they were logged in a cellar book. The Harwood House did quite, entertain lavishly and frequently, but the rum was very sparingly used. It was a very, very highly valued part. It was logged as cane spirit. We didn't call it by any crude name like rum, rumbustious, cane spirit. This is the actual cellar book. So this is why we have this great record of it. And the last 16 bottles sold for over 100,000 pounds. And as I say, it very well reflects rum's history because by the 20th century, there's simply no record. There's no record of it being used in the 20th century. So it kind of accurately reflects rum's fortunes. But this lesson was about, rum's history and this idea that it was, always just, I've seen people write this thing, it was always a cheap spirit, it was drunk by pirates, and the reason why we link rum with pirates, because guess what? Pirates dealt with valuable things. Anything of value. And again, we also heard that in Jeff's lecture, how pirates were people who wanted to, they became pirates because they wanted to live as wealthy people. They wanted their fortune, and they just wanted it by a shortcut. So that's why rum was linked. Everybody's favorite lesson. Rum should be sweet, never sweetened. Yeah, for me, great rum is beautifully sweet, and it's because we have such a wonderful raw material. Just take a piece of sugar cane, crush it in your mouth, walk in a sugar factory, smell the cane crushing, smell the syrup boiling. It's sweet, and naturally distilled rum has the most beautiful sweet aroma. Compare fresh rum with fresh whiskey. Give me a break. Cereal. There's no comparison. So if there's any spirit that should not be sweetened, it's rum, because it has a natural sweetness. Great rum has a natural sweetness. Freshly distilled, even in the barrel aging, still has a beautiful sweetness. And if you put sugar in it, you destroy that sweetness. You destroy that natural sweetness. You can no longer distinguish it. So one of the greatest attributes of rum, you wreck it. And I want to then explain, well, okay, that's great, that's my philosophy, so why do other people put the sugar in the rum? Well, there's a long, long history of adulteration for profit. A long, long history. Whether it was putting water in milk, sulfuric acid in watered down whiskey, or grease in butter, people do dodgy things for many reasons. But I want to dispel this particular myth that it was somehow some kind of tradition. No. Dodgy practices, yes, are traditional for all kinds of reasons, but it was not any part of any artisanal tradition to put sugar in any spirit. And one great insight into that was this document here. In 1908, there was a Royal Commission on whiskey and other potable spirits, and the reason for this was in this time, as I say, 19th century, a lot of people, we look back at the 19th century with fondness, but you don't realize this was one of the most dodgiest eras in terms of food and spirits adulteration and the unbelievable practices that went on at the time. And so this is a period when we first saw, food legislation to protect foodstuffs and labeling and first kind of what we would call consumer protection. And this was very much in this mold. This is the first time anybody wrote down rules. And sometimes people talk about rum not having any rules. We're going to deal with that shortly. No spirit really had any rules until this period in England. This is the first time that they all sat down, gathered a whole bunch of evidence, and decided if it says whiskey on a bottle, this is what we mean. If it says rum on a bottle, this is what we mean. So it's a good opportunity to look at how the sugar issue was dealt with. And it was dealt with here on the category of liqueurs. So they made it very clear that sweetened spirits are similarly described as spirits to which any matter has been added after distillation, which imparts to the quantity of sweetness and produces an obscuration over 0.6%. I can explain what that is in a minute. So it was very clear. You had spirits and you had liqueurs. This thing we call obscuration, that word came about because the way the customs checked proof was a hydrometer. And there's one way to screw up the hydrometer was to put sugar in it. Because the hydrometer works by density, and if you put sugar in, you screw with the density of the spirit, and so it was called obscuration. So putting sugar in would have been seen as a way to cheat a taxman. Today, we use a hydrometer test for more or less the same reason. We have more sophisticated methods to check proof. But the famous hydrometer test is based on the obscuration caused by sugar. So, any suggestion that sugar was sort of the norm is ludicrous. And this topic of doctoring rum, as they say, these shenanigans, it's very old. This is not a new thing the guys have come up with. And Arroyo published this in the Journal of Sugar in July 1942. He's the greatest published academic in rum, if you don't know who Arroyo is. And so he was describing it here from a different context. Arroyo had a belief with making rum. You made the rum, you distill the rum, and then you put it in a barrel, and he called it curing. And his philosophy was that you aged it for a specific amount of time, and then once it was palatable, that's it, drinking. He wasn't into this going 10 and 15 years and all of that. We would probably have a bit of a debate today, but never mind. So he called this curing, and so in this section of this article, he was lamenting that people were shortcutting this curing process by adding all these dodgy things, including sugars and infusions and all this. So he described that as shortcutting this way of saying curing by quick methods. So he was very, very dead against it. And he actually wrote this little piece, the idea of producing industrial alcohol first and then trying to artificially convert it to high quality rum is absolutely erroneous and has given rise to the innumerable poor representatives of true rum now in the American market. So the same problem that we described today is described in 1942. This line here will unfortunately read a bit sad because he actually said most of these brands will be utterly unsaleable in Europe, where the true and genuine taste of rum is easily distinguished by the consuming public. I'm sorry, I believed that until you guys started to drink Don Papa, and then I lost all faith in you after that. So I'm no longer going to give you the credit that Arroyo would give you. I just came across this very recently. A friend of mine published it on his page on Facebook, and he was publishing it because this was an article on cocktail making in the period, and he was really complaining about bitters, but he made this comment in passing, which I thought was hilarious. The nether depth was reached when sugar was combined with rum, which is a crime against nature. And so he was coming to say, from this philosophy of mine, that it's ridiculous that you would add sugar, because this here is a cocktail and spirits writer, so he's saying, why on earth would you add sugar to something that's beautifully sweet? So that was 1890. So we've been having these arguments for a long time. So why do people sweeten? Well, as I say, people adulterate for a lot of reasons. In other words, profit reasons. But I thought I would make it a little more specific here, because we can see these correlations in the market, and we can see that sweetened rums are often come from mass-produced blends. And this makes perfect sense, because if you're going to sweeten a rum, you simply don't need to make it in an artisanal way. So why spend the money? You can get mass-produced rum. If you're going to teach people that sweetness is the sign of quality, you don't need anything other than sweetness. Sweetened rums often have a misleading or no age statement. Again, if you're going to teach people that sweetness is a sign of quality and age, you don't actually have to age it. So of course, faced with this problem that you want to flog a 2-year-old rum as high quality, you've got to make up an age. That's how you solve that problem. Sweetened rums are often sold in expensive packaging because you're going to tell these people that it's high quality and you need to have a consistent message. You see, you have to understand, think of spirit making. We aspire to drink straight spirits. This is something we aspire from youth. We may try our parents' spirits, spit it out. So we link the appreciation of straight spirits with maturity, our own maturity. We also aspire to have good taste. So when something is sold as expensive and in a beautiful packaging, we want to like it because we want to feel we have good taste. So the sugar guy, he's selling you an illusion. He's selling you an illusion that you're drinking a straight spirit so you feel big and mature. He's selling you an illusion that you have great taste. So you buy it, you pay lots of money for it. And then when someone comes along to me and tells you that's shit, you get very upset. Because no one likes illusions to be shattered. Rum is diverse. I think you guys know that. People don't necessarily appreciate why we got this diversity. Sometimes I hear nonsense things like rum has no rules and we're going to deal with that. And so therefore in the Caribbean we were free from these terrible bureaucrats, and that's why we became so wonderfully diverse. It's a much more interesting story. We became diverse because of our social and economic history. And I'll give you a very, very brief snapshot of that, because it's obviously an incredibly complex subject. So what happens is, 17th and 18th century is biggest producers of others in Jamaica. You say the French are kept under control because they can't export. It's outlawed in the Spanish colonies. They do have lots of bush rum. And we're all the same way. Today, we associate Dunda, for example, with Jamaica. But Dunda was the norm. Every rum producer in the English colonies, Barbados, Antigua, St. Vincent, Jamaica, all made rums with Dunda. We all made what you would call today high ester rums. That's not to say that Jamaica didn't carve out this particularly super high ester rums, and that was only within one particular part of Jamaica. So that's a separate story. But generally speaking, in this period, we all make rums the same way. Chaos comes in the 19th century. In the 19th century, the column still arrives, and cultivated yeast arrive. So what happens is the column still starts to get adopted, and of course this makes a very, very different spirit. And the yeast we start making short fermentations. And this big diversion occurs with Jamaica on one side and Barbados and Demerara on the other. So column stills start arriving in Barbados and Guyana, cultivated yeast. And remember that same 1908 Royal Commission, they were actually faced with deciding whether these two fundamentally different rums should both be called rum. So they had on one side this Demerara rum that was used in the column still in 48-hour fermentation, and Jamaica rum, 100% pot still and 100% natural fermentation, and they actually debated, are these both rum? Unfortunately for us and the spirit whiskey industry, because at this time more or less all the oil producers were dead against the column still, and I'll show you a little bit on that as well. But the commissioners were very, very indifferent. They really didn't give a shit like how we do. They weren't geeks. And they more or less said, you know, whiskey's from grain and rum's from sugarcane producing countries. They didn't want to get into the nitty gritty, and so from henceforth, Demerara rum and Jamaica rum were both rum. So we had this big split. We had this big split here. But what was also happening in the 19th century is on the French side, they started to relax production, relax the rules on export of rum, and the French then got into the rum in a big way. But we also had, and that was molasses-based rum. Martinique was a huge, huge producer of molasses-based rum. Had the phylloxera. That was one of the things that also helped reduce the restrictions to allow the Martinique rum industry to grow. But what also happened, of course, was the birth of agriculture. And that came about from a number of factors, but one of the major factors was the Haitian Revolution. Haitian Revolution came along. Napoleon didn't want to buy sugar from the Caribbean anymore. He plants beet sugar. And so, of course, this is very damaging for many sugar estates in the French islands. They can't convert all of their sugarcane to sugar. One little subcontext to that is that one of the things that happens with sugarcane is when you crush sugarcane, when you harvest sugarcane, you need to get it to the sugar factory very quickly. So in these island sugar factories were dotted all over. Beet molasses is not like this. Beet molasses, you can have a long period. And so what happened is when they developed beet molasses in France, they would have very centralized factories which were more efficient. And so the French decided, hey, we want more centralized factories in Martinique and Guadeloupe. So this left more of these agricultural producers on their own. And so they had to crush the cane and turn it into rum. So this is the birth of agriculture. And the Spanish get into it. And they're helped out by the Americans, because the Americans will buy rum from Cuba, they won't buy rum from English islands. But the Spanish get into it, and they get into it in the period of the column sale. So they make a much, much lighter style. And I make this diversion here because I do want to split between the Spanish and became even lighter, and then all these dodgy flavored rums that are associated with that style today. Then we lost pot stills in many of the small islands, places like St. Vincent, Grenada. These are all column still today. They were pot still up to quite recently. And then Jamaica finally capitulated and added column stills, but some pure pot still ones still remain. So this is my highly simplified, but I want to get across the point that this diversity has a fascinating history. And everything we do today is because of the history. It's not because somebody sat down and said, oh, I want a pot still. Oh, I think natural fermentation is great. This is knowledge handed down and the economics at the time driving it. One of the things I love to point out in my seminars is we also evolved a much more sophisticated form of distillation in the Caribbean. Picture tells 1,000 words. That's your classic European pot still, double distillation. This is Scotland. This is the Caribbean pot still, and it evolved. We started first with a simple one, just like Scotland. We added a retort, So for many years it was a pot and a single retort. Then there was a double retort. So eventually most were converted to pot and double retort. And then there was again a split between Guyana, Barbados, and Jamaica. Guyana and Barbados, we added a rectifier. Jamaica did not. And so you see this. And the thing to appreciate here, the part I want you to appreciate, it's very easy to think of the Caribbean as small and backward and unsophisticated, and rum tasted awful in the old days, and it was cheap and nasty, and we were poor and backward people. But again, rum making, we are the kings of the world in the 17th, 18th, and competitive in the 19th century. So as kings of the world, and the oldest rum spirit producers, way over than Scotch whiskey, this is why we are able to develop this more sophisticated technology as technology came in. Yeah. And this is what you see through the Caribbean. You see this pot and double retort system. Totally different than what you see in Scotland. St. Lucia, that's us. Jamaica, Guyana, Grenada, another one in Barbados, that's Mount Gage, that's one in Park. This is our way of making spirits. Lesson 6, rum has rules. It's one of the worst myths ever pervaded on rum. That rum doesn't have rules, or that the other way I've seen this written, which is equally stupid. Rum doesn't have any universal rules, or the countries of rum will never get together and form rules. Well, guess what? Whiskey doesn't have universal rules either. And no countries are getting together in whiskey to have a universal rule either. Don't know why rum has this nonsense associated with it. Here are the rules in Martinique. We're not going to go through them. It's just enough for me to prove to you that they exist. Here are the rum rules in CARICOM. This is places like Barbados and Jamaica. Again, it is enough that they exist. Here is the EU definition of rum in the EU. It's not the greatest, but it does have some useful features. It does say rum, for example, shall not be flavored. So again, rum does have rules. I mean, people do actually write, oh, well, rum doesn't have any rules, so this is why this rum from whatever country has whatever shit it has added into it. This is nonsense. Rules apply. But there is some truth to this rum not having rules. There is an element of truth to this. There's a bit of fire with that smoke, and I'll explain what I mean. So over in the States, the TTB regulates things, and there is your rule for rum, and there is your rule for whiskey. Now, the first thing you should notice is that they are nearly identical. So contrary to popular belief that there's no rules for rum, in actual fact, the rules for rum and whiskey in the United States are identical. So, why do we have this myth, or why do we have this difference? Well, the little clue is here. So what happens is, in America, most of the whiskey sold in America, nearly every drop of it sold in America, is not sold under the generic rule. It is sold under the specific rules for the subcategories. So if you label a bottle of Scotch whiskey, and you sell it in America, look whose rules you have to follow. If you label it Irish whiskey, look whose rules you have to follow. Hell, they even recognize the Canadians.
Don't get upset.
So the part is missing is where it goes. Jamaica rum, follow Jamaica's rules. Barbados rum, follow Barbados' rules. Martinique rum, follow Martinique's rules. This is where you can put the word agricole in any shit you want in America. So the element of truth is that not that we don't have rules, it's just that they're not recognized. We are not given the same deference and respect that cognac or Scotch whiskey is. In the EU, there's a mechanism for recognizing these things across countries. It's called a GI, geographical indication. The EU recognizes a GI for Scotch whisky. That means that the rules for Scotch whisky have to be recognized in all the members of the EU. God knows what happens after Brexit. Never known anybody volunteer for such a stupid idea as that. But I'll try to avoid politics. Yeah, so maybe after Brexit, everybody run out and print some Scotch whisky labels and cash them while you can, because there will be no protection on that next day. So what we're trying to do in the Caribbean is create our GIs. So here's Scotch whisky, United Kingdom, and that's what you'll hear. And one of the frustrations we have is that, of course, big companies certain companies don't like to have GIs and rules. Certain countries are very happy to work on the generic rules or bland rules. Okay? And so therefore you will hear propaganda against the GI, that it's stifling innovation, or that it's gonna, restrict diversity. This is bullshit. The GI protects the diversity. In other words, let me put it to you this way. Right now, a bottle of Barbados rum and a bottle of Jamaican rum is sold in Europe under the same rules. That is not protecting diversity. That is compromising it. If Jamaica gets a GI, Barbados gets a GI, and the European Union says we recognize them both, that means the Jamaican rum is on the Jamaican rules and the Barbados rum is on the Barbados rule. Diversity is protected. Sometimes we need these bureaucrats. I think this is the last. Does anyone try? You can go ahead and start trying. This is short. So the first rum on your left is Foursquare Principia. It is 9 years old. It is 3 years in bourbon, followed by 6 years in sherry casks. These are old sherry casks, they're not first fill sherry casks. And it's at cask strength 62. The second bottle, so the one on your right, is Destino. This is 14 years old. It spent 12 years in first fill ex Madeira before transferred for 2 more years in some very, very old ex bourbon casks. These casks have been in rum for many, many years. It is 61%. So I will put it as you have on your glass. So rum has a classification problem. I can sum it up really, really easily. Somebody gives you a cocktail recipe. It says 2.5 ounces of white rum. You're going to get a very, very different experience depending on which one you pick. So we have a problem. This is the solution for all those who went to Lucas class. The solution is based, it's classifying rum on high speed. And it's rooted in our history. So what we call pure single rum is the analog of single malt. It's what has to be 100% in a pot still. We call it pure single rum. Pure meaning it's unblended, not pure, free from additives. This is not a classification for the pures. If you put anything in the rum, you do not play in this game here. So pure here means unblended. In other words, only a pot still. Single means single distillery. This is the language of Scotch whisky. I say language of Scotch whisky, but that Royal Commission I mentioned to you, we were there too. We claim as much ownership to this language as Scotch whisky. Single blended, what you guys know as blended whiskey, is of course famously a pot and column blend. But rum is special. We have single blended. I know today that blended whiskey kind of has a bad name because, and part of that is because the blended part of the whiskey, the column part, tends to be coming from big mass, green whiskey stills. Rum is special because each distiller has their own column still. So we take this as much pride and care in our column still as our pot still. So rum has single blended. and then we make the split between those. Yes, these are ones using column, but we make the split between the traditional column stills and that modern, dreadful looking thing there. And it's rooted in history. Okay. That same document, that 1908 Royal Commission, it was a fabulous document. They gathered evidence in from all the producers, and they wrote this little snapshot of what was happening in British Guyana at the time. Remember, Guyana was one of the earliest ones to adopt the column still. And so it's very interesting because it reflects exactly what we're talking about. So basically what they said was is in Guyana, there were 3 kinds of distilleries. There were one using only pot stills. That's our pure single rum. There were some using both pot and column. That's our single blended. And there were ones using only continuous stills, column stills. And this is the Caribbean today. Go to St. Vincent. It's this one. Go to Barbados or Jamaica. It's this one. Go to certain distilleries in Jamaica. It's this one. So classify rum by how it's made. I do a whole seminar on classification, so I don't want to go into too much detail. I think sometimes when people hear the word classification, they expect that you're going to sum up in one category everything that there is to know about a rum. No. Think of classification like the chapters on a book. So there's a chapter pure single rum. Now you got to read the rest to learn about it. The classification is a way of putting things together in a way that's useful. I want to just put this little piece in. This was an interview at the. This was a little interview. This was so at the same Royal Commission. J.C. Nolan was the special commission of the Jamaican government. He gave evidence to this commission on behalf of the Jamaican government. And the reason why I've included here is just to show you how passionate these guys were dead against the column still. And today, I'm a single blended producer. I love my column still. But the reason why I just want to show it to you is because if these guys were so passionate about the column still and the legitimacy of it, I think we owe it to them to know whether the rum we drink is either a pot still or a column still or a blended of both. This is how seriously they took it. So he was being interviewed, and as he said, this was one of the massive controversies of this Royal Commission. Was the column still okay? Was it legit? And as he said, the commissioners didn't give a shit. They just said, yeah, whiskey is from grain. We don't care how you make it. But it's very much against how the producers felt. Producers were very, very passionate. Here's him. In your opinion, is all patent still rum objected and refused as Jamaican rum? Patent still mean the column still. Yes, my lord, it cannot be sold as Jamaican rum. Have you ever tried it in Jamaica? No, we would not want to. It would ruin our industry. Is the difference perfectly recognizable by the ordinary consumer? I think so. And as I say, by this time, Barbados and Guyana, we had column stills, and he's saying, you could not call it some of the spirits made in Barbados rum at all. It's very much, as I say, against the column still. And so this is how the solution works in practice. We would no longer just call this white rum, we would call this pure single rum, and we would call that rum. So we would make that distinction. That's it. That's your lesson. It's done. So time to do Questions? Don't be shy. That's what the rum is to give you some flavor. That's from my distillation seminar. No.
So just as a consumer, how can you tell the difference if there's not so much obfuscation going on in the industry? Like, if you want to be purist about it.
One of the reasons why you come here, education. Yes, education. Yeah, I mean, our mission as producers has been education. And so the education starts at bloggers and writers and guys behind the bar. In other words, teach, and it will come true.
Can you just
That's why I'm here. I could be home. I could be home in Barbados. And again, I could have done a whole spiel on marketing. I could have told you all wondrous things that, you know, Foursquare Spirit is full of honey and all kinds of wondrous things. But I'd rather come and educate you. We legitimately feel that a better educated audience is ultimately in our field. So you're here. That's a great first. If it's your first step, but that's a great step.
Just looking back at the history of the pot still and the twin retorts, or what was the main reason from going from a normal like European pot still to the twin retorts?
It's hard. People don't write these things down. It's hard to piece together. My feeling is that what happened is that people put two pot stills together, and that took a bit of a skilled operation. And then when you do a distillation or a wash still, you normally have to do several distillations in a wash still to make a spirit distillation. So that second pot still could shrink and become a single retort. So that's what I feel is the motivation. So they were making one distillation and one go with a pot and single retort.
Efficiency.
The clever part is when someone figured out to go to two retorts. That's one of those simple steps that took a real spark of genius to decide to do.
So the reason for that would be like.
Well, once you split the two retorts, you could take 4 fractions.
Okay.
Heads, heart, what we call high wines and low wines.
Yeah.
You could split your tails because you could recycle your tails. You know, normally in a spirit, you recycle your tails in a second spirit distillation. Well, now when you have two retorts, you know that first retort is like your spirit still. But now when you have two retorts, you can recycle that split tails in low wines and high wines. So you keep that split in the next distillation.
See, when you're taking your hearts cut, does that get returned to the next distillation then with the wash?
No.
So
no, heart's hard.
Oh, sorry, your head. Sorry, yeah, like your,
Yes,
your
the
head.
heads.
Yes,
And people do different things with their heads.
Okay,
yeah. Any other questions?
So I wanted to ask you about